Before the United States existed, before the White House existed, and before the idea of the American dream was born, there were people who had long been living on this land. They are the Native Americans, tribes with their own culture, language, laws, and sacred connection to their land. But with the arrival of the Europeans, and later the United States government, their land, freedom, and way of life gradually disappeared. This is the story of the systematic land grabbing, not only through violence, but through laws, agreements, and deception. But before anything else, if you are fond of historical stories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. Even before the Europeans arrived in North America, there were people who had long been living in the vast land of the continent. This was not an empty land, and even more so, it was not a new world. For thousands of years, the land has been home to an estimated 10 to 15 million Native Americans, depending on the estimates of historians. They are composed of hundreds of different tribes. Each has its own language, culture, and way of life. These tribes are not a single society. In the Northeast, for example, the tribes belonging to the Iroquois Confederacy existed, which had an organized government and a council composed of leaders from each tribe. In the Southeast, the Cherokee and other tribes had permanent villages and systematic agriculture. In the Plains, tribes such as the Lakota and Cheyenne relied on the bison as the center of their food, clothing, and culture, especially after the use of horses spread among them. In the Southwest, tribes like the Hopi and the ancestors of the Pueblo built strong dwellings and used irrigation to survive in the dry environment. This shows that the Native Americans were not just wandering around. They had a clear order, governance, and knowledge of how to live long-term in their environment. The land was very important in their lives, but its meaning is different compared to the perspective of the Europeans. For many tribes, the land is not usually considered the private property of a person. It is a sacred inheritance from their ancestors and the source of life for future generations. They believe that man is part of nature and not that nature belongs to man. In other words, even before the arrival of the Europeans, North America was a living continent. There were towns, farms, trade routes, and deep culture. When the Europeans arrived in North America in the late 15th century, they did not consider the natives as the true owners of the land. Even though it was clear that there were people living on the land, the colonizers believed that they still had the right to claim it. This belief is not just an opinion. It has a source of ideas, religion, and eventually law. One of the most important concepts used by Europeans is the so-called doctrine of discovery. This doctrine arose from several papal bulls of the Catholic Church in the 15th century that provided moral and legal justification for Christian nations to conquer and control the lands of non-Christians. Under this logic, when a Christian country discovers a land, it has the highest right to the land, even if there are already people living there. For Europeans, the word discovery does not mean that the place is uninhabited. That means that the inhabitants there are not Christians. Because of this, Native Americans were considered to have limited rights. They could stay on the land, but the highest ownership went to the European nation that first arrived. Later, the United States claimed the same idea. Although it is no longer under the Catholic Church, the country maintained the logic of the doctrine of discovery. In the decision, Johnson v. McIntosh, in 1823, the Supreme Court declared that only the government has the right to buy land from Native Americans, and that the tribes have the right to live but do not fully own it. At this point, the deep conflict began, not because the Native Americans had no laws, but because the laws that were used against them were created by the conquerors and never asked for permission from the people who truly lived on the land. In 1776, when the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain, the new nation called the United States was born. But at that moment, the new government's problem was not only against the former empire. There is another big issue that needs to be addressed: the land of the Native Americans. At this time, various tribes still controlled vast parts of the continent. They are not part of the United States and are not considered by its citizens either. Instead, the government regarded them as separate communities or nations that needed to be talked to and signed into agreements. Because of this, the United States began to make treaties or agreements with Native American tribes. On paper, the government's promise was clear: the land of the tribes will be recognized, or they will be protected against the encroachment of settlers, and their autonomy will be respected. In return, The United States often requests the right to use some parts of the land or to buy it outright. Between 1778 and 1871, more than 370 treaties were signed between the United States and various tribes. These documents are formally part of the law, approved by Congress, and have the weight equivalent to federal law. But in reality, the government rarely kept these promises. Many agreements were signed under intense pressure. There were tribes threatened with war, starvation, or complete extermination if they did not sign. There are questions that are not fully understood in the English language or the legal meaning of the documents. There are also times when others sign even though they do not represent the entire tribe. When it is discovered that the land is rich, has gold, fertile farmland, or important locations, the agreement is often changed or disregarded. When the white settlers who entered the tribal lands increased, the government rarely stopped them. Instead, the Native Americans were said to have left to avoid trouble. Gradually, the way the United States viewed the tribes also changed. From being negotiating nations, they were simply considered as communities under the authority of the state and federal governments. In many instances, treaties were used not to protect Native Americans, but to legitimize the acquisition of their land. In 1871, the Congress decided to stop and make decisions for the Native Americans. The making of new treaties with Native American tribes. Since then, they were no longer considered separate nations to be dealt with, but communities directly governed by the federal government. And from here, history will lead to a more blatant stage of forced displacement. A stage that is not only hidden in the documents, but openly carried out by the United States government. By the first part of the 19th century, the United States was rapidly expanding. White settlers are increasing, and the need for land is rising, especially in the southeast, where the soil is fertile and suitable for farming. But these lands are not vacant. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes have long been living here. Instead of respecting existing agreements, the government and the states gradually erased the faster and more violent way of expansion. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. On paper, the relocation of Native Americans to the west of the Mississippi River is said to be voluntary. But in reality, this voluntariness became compulsory. The tribes were forced to sign treaties with threats of violence, starvation, or war. They exchanged their lands in the east in exchange for lands further away and difficult to live in. Many tribes protested. The Cherokee, for example, used the law to fight for their rights. In 1832 inches, the case of Worcester v. Georgia, he filed with the Supreme Court that the state of Georgia had no right to seize, include the land of the Cherokee. In other words, the court limited the power of the state, but the administration did not enforce it. Instead, the pressure and forced displacement continued, proof that politics and land interests prevailed over the court's decision. One of the darkest chapters of this time, the so-called Trail of Tears, from 1838 to 1839, thousands of Cherokee were forcibly walked from their homes in Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina to the so-called Indian Territory. They traveled more than 1,200 kilometers while being guarded by the military. In the midst of the cold, lack of food, and the spread of disease, many children, elderly, and sick people died. More than 4,000 Cherokee died, almost 1/4 of their population at that time. Not only the Cherokee suffered this, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole also went through various forced displacements. Thousands died of starvation, disease, and violence. Some fought back, but often ended in more brutal clashes. The Removal Act is considered a legal step for progress and expansion, but for Native Americans, this was clearly land grabbing, a violation of treaties and the destruction of their way of life. They lost not only their homes, but also the graves of their ancestors, sacred places, and the connection to the land that was the center of their identity. The Trail of Tears was not an accident or a natural disaster. That is a result of the state's deliberate policy that prioritizes the interests of the more powerful over the rights of the first inhabitants of the land. And even after many years have passed, the memory and wounds that it left in the history of Native Americans remain alive. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States continued to expand westward. During this time, the idea of manifest destiny further spread, the belief that it was ordained by God and history for America to expand its territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific, even at the cost of claiming the lands of the natives and other nations. For many white settlers and leaders of the country, this was not just ambition but a moral duty. Expansion was considered a sign of progress and civilization. But for Native Americans and other residents of the West, this was the beginning of greater conflicts and wars. Manifest destiny was used as a moral and political basis to seize land. This was not just an idea, it became a guide to government decisions. From the dispatch of the army to the permission for settlers to occupy the territories of the tribes, the result was what is called the Indian Wars, a series of wars and campaigns that lasted for many decades. One of the most talked about and well-known is the Battle of Little Big Horn in 1876, where Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led the Lakota and Cheyenne against the American forces of George Custer. Custer and most of his troops lost. It was tough, so George Custer was best known in LA, but the victory was only temporary. After a few years, the government's campaign intensified again, and the tribe was finally defeated and removed. Another tragedy was the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1,890 inches South Dakota. Instead of an active battle, the Lakota, including women, children, and the elderly, were ambushed by the American Army using weapons and artillery. It is considered a symbol of the end of the day. Armed struggle of many tribes against the United States. The history of the United States is not just a story of freedom and democracy. It is also a story of denial of rights, deception, and forced land grabbing. Until now, the struggle of the Native Americans for land, for dignity, and for the truth of their history continues, because the land that was seized then continues to remind us that the progress of one has been at the expense of the destruction of others. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos about history.